Welcome to a Miss Marple Detective Mystery Audiobook. The Wrongly Accused, a Miss Marple Mystery. If you're new to our channel, we invite you to subscribe and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our daily releases of captivating detective tales. And if you enjoy our content, don't forget to leave a like to show your support. For our loyal listeners, welcome back! We're excited to have you here again. Let's dive into another unforgettable tale. The rain had come in fits and starts that evening, drumming against the leaded windows of Pemberton Manor with an insistent tapping, as though the heavens themselves sought entry to the grand but joyless house. The storm had passed now, leaving behind an uneasy stillness, the sort that settles over a place when something unnatural has occurred within its walls. Emily Carter, housemaid to Sir Geoffrey Pemberton, had always considered herself a sensible girl, not prone to fainting spells or hysterics like those young women in cheap penny novels, but when she stepped into the study that night, all sense and sensibility deserted her. Sir Geoffrey was there, of course, but not as he should have been. He lay sprawled beside his great mahogany desk, his head turned at an unnatural angle, eyes glassy and unseeing. Blood had pooled beneath his temple, staining the expensive Persian rug a deep, grotesque crimson. A heavy brass candlestick, its ornate handle now smeared with something dark and unmistakable, lay discarded beside him, as though the murderer had dropped it carelessly after the deed was done. Emily stood frozen in the doorway, her breath caught somewhere between her ribs. The grand old clock on the desk had toppled to the floor, its face shattered, the delicate hands halted at 8:15 p.m., a silent, motionless witness to the crime. For a long moment she did nothing. Then, quite suddenly, her body obeyed her mind, and she screamed. The sound ripped through the manor, piercing the silence like a shard of broken glass. Footsteps thundered along the corridors, hurried, hesitant, some too slow, others too quick, revealing in their very urgency the underlying tension that ran through the house. First to arrive was Henry Pemberton, nephew to the deceased and heir to his fortune, a slim, dark-haired man in his early 30s, whose usual charm was now marred by a flicker of something between shock and calculation. He took in the scene with the kind of composure one might expect from a man used to unpleasant surprises. Behind him the housekeeper, Mrs. Tremaine, materialized. Severe, sharp-eyed, her mouth set in a grim line, she had lived long enough to recognize death when she saw it, and even longer to know when it was inconvenient. There were others, too. The butler, grim-faced and silent, a nervous young footman peering from the hallway, the village doctor, summoned in haste, coat still damp from the rain, each one absorbing the horror before them, and each one thinking very different thoughts. But Emily saw none of them. She was still staring at the lifeless figure on the floor, her hands trembling, whispering under her breath, "Oh, dear Lord, he's gone." Henry, eyes fixed on his uncle's body, said nothing for a moment. Then, with a voice of forced steadiness, he turned to the doctor. "Well, I suppose you had better confirm what we all know." Dr. Sims crouched beside the body, his fingers cool and professional as he checked for a pulse that wasn't there. He straightened a moment later. "There's no doubt about it," he said quietly. "He's been dead at least an hour." Henry exhaled, long and slow. His expression was unreadable. "Murder, then?" Dr. Sims looked down at the bloodied candlestick, his lips thinned. "I don't think there's much question of that." By the time the local constable, a solid man named Harper, arrived with the ever-dutiful Inspector Craddock from Scotland Yard, St. Mary Mead was already buzzing with speculation. The village, small as it was, had an exceptional talent for stretching a rumour into a tapestry. The murder of Sir Geoffrey Pemberton, a man both rich and widely disliked, was the sort of event that set tongues wagging and suspicious minds racing. Over tea in her modest but well-ordered cottage, Miss Agatha Marple listened with quiet interest to the news brought by Mrs. Finch, the vicar's wife, whose breathless account of the crime was peppered with her usual exaggerations and small inaccuracies. And they say, though of course one never knows with servants, that his head was bashed in quite horribly, blood all over that fine Turkish rug, simply ruined, and poor Henry standing there so shocked. Though between you and me, dear, I always thought he had a rather mercenary look about him." Miss Marple, knitting needles clicking softly, did not look up. "Shocked, was he? Well, naturally. To find one's uncle murdered in one's own house, it's enough to give anyone a turn, don't you think?" Miss Marple murmured, her needles never pausing. "That would depend, wouldn't it, on whether one had truly been surprised." There was a pause, just a fraction of a second too long, before Mrs. Finch let out a nervous little laugh. "Oh, Miss Marple, you do have such a way of putting things." The elderly lady smiled, a kind, indulgent thing, but there was something in her sharp blue eyes that said she was already thinking, sifting, turning the puzzle over in her mind. And as she sat there, watching Mrs. Finch's animated retelling, her hands steady, her expression mild, the first piece of the mystery slipped quietly into place. By the time dawn crept over St. Mary Mead, the murder of Sir Geoffrey Pemberton had woven itself into every conversation from the churchyard to the greengrocer's. The village, so often drowsing in the predictable rhythms of afternoon teas and bridge games, now pulsed with an uncommon energy, each whisper-laden exchange adding another layer to the ever-growing tale. At the Fox and Hound, the only pub of any real reputation, Mr. Needham, the butcher, leaned in close to the vicar's wife, his voice thick with speculation. "Bludgeon, they say," he murmured, eyes darting about as if the very walls might listen in. "Quite the mess. Blood all over that fancy rug, and they've arrested him? Grayson, the schoolmaster?" Mrs. Finch gasped, pressing a gloved hand to her chest. "Oh, Mr. Grayson? But surely not. He's such a mild man, always so precise about things." "Aye, well, mild men have tempers too," Needham muttered. "And they found his fingerprints on the murder weapon, plain as day." On the far side of the pub, Miss Agatha Marple, quietly pouring tea from a delicate porcelain pot, made no comment. She did not need to. Her needles clicked steadily, her thoughts moving faster than her fingers. Constable Harper, a man whose greatest concern until now had been ensuring the vicar's bicycle wasn't stolen on Sundays, was thoroughly out of his depth. Still, he did his best to look severe, as he stood in Sir Geoffrey's study, notebook in hand, while Inspector Craddock of Scotland Yard examined the scene. Craddock was a man of unshakable practicality. He neither leapt to conclusions nor suffered fools gladly. And yet even he could not deny that the case against Albert Grayson was distressingly straightforward. "Last seen entering the manor at approximately 8 o'clock, Craddock said, flipping through his notes. "Saw him leave. The victim was struck at precisely 8:15 p.m., or so that broken clock suggests. And then, of course—" He gestured towards the murder weapon still on the evidence table, a solid brass candlestick, its ornate handle marred by deep red stains. "His fingerprints," Harper added, as though this detail neatly closed the matter. Craddock exhaled sharply through his nose. "Yes, his fingerprints. Right there on the candlestick." A pause settled over the room. It was the kind of silence that needed no words to voice its significance. At last, Craddock sighed and snapped his notebook shut. "Right. Let's have him in." Albert Grayson had been roused from his bed at an ungodly hour, dragged from his modest cottage on the edge of the village, and deposited in the cramped sitting-room of the local station before he'd even had a chance to button his waistcoat properly. A man of gentle habits, thin spectacles, and a lifelong preference for order, Albert was precisely the kind of person whom one would never suspect of murder, until of course one had a murder to solve, and then he became frighteningly convenient. Inspector Craddock observed him with a critical eye. The man was pale, shaken, but not hysterical. He sat very still, hands folded in his lap, as though his whole body had conspired to appear as unthreatening as possible. "Mr. Grayson," Craddock began, "you were seen entering Pemberton Manor at 8 o'clock last night." Albert's eyes flickered. "Yes, Inspector, that is true." "But no one saw you leave?" Albert hesitated, then pushed his spectacles up the bridge of his nose with a trembling hand. "He left a note?" he said finally. "I didn't see, Sir Geoffrey. I slipped the letter under his study door and left at once." Craddock leaned back. "And yet your fingerprints were found on the very candlestick used to kill him." For the first time, genuine fear flitted across Albert's face. His hands resting on his knees curled slightly. "I don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never touched it." Harper, standing at attention beside the fireplace, snorted. "And yet there they were, plain as anything." Albert shook his head, as if by sheer force of denial he could undo the evidence. "I am telling you, I did not touch that candlestick. I have never in all my life laid a hand on it." Craddock sighed. He had dealt with liars, scoundrels, and men with nerves frayed beyond repair, and yet, watching Albert Grayson, his hunched posture, his bewildered eyes, he could not help but feel an unease he did not like. "You have no alibi," Craddock said, "and your prints are on the weapon. Mr. Grayson, do you have anything else to say for yourself?" For a long moment Albert sat there, swallowed in silence. Then, softly, he whispered, "I am innocent." Craddock closed his notebook with a snap. "That's as may be. But I'm afraid, Mr. Grayson, that's for the courts to decide." And with that the arrest was made. By noon the village was in a state of delicious hysteria. The idea of Albert Grayson, school-teacher and part-time bird-watcher, as a cold-blooded killer was met with equal parts shock and satisfaction. The tea-shop was alive with murmurs, and in the very centre of it all sat Miss Marple, a small, neat figure in a well-pressed dress, her knitting as methodical as ever. Opposite her, Mrs. Finch was in high spirits, the thrill of scandal having momentarily erased the mild rheumatism in her knee. "And did you hear," she was saying, eyes alight, "his prints on the weapon? I mean, what more could one possibly need?" Miss Marple smiled, a vague, non-committal sort of smile. "Oh," she murmured, her fingers never pausing, "one often needs quite a bit more, I find." Mrs. Finch blinked. "More? But it's all so clear. No alibi, last one seen—" "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Very convenient." The two words hung in the air, soft but insistent. Mrs. Finch, missing their weight entirely, rattled on, but Miss Marple was no longer listening. Her gaze had drifted out the window towards the rolling green hills beyond, her expression as mild as ever. And yet, behind those bright, innocent eyes, the first threads of doubt had begun to weave themselves into something very dangerous indeed. The courtroom at Melford Assizes was a grand but airless affair. Oak-panelled walls, a vaulted ceiling, and an atmosphere of stifling decorum, occasionally punctuated by the rustle of silk and the muted whispers of interested onlookers. Trials in St. Mary Mead were rare occurrences, and rarer still was the opportunity to witness a man of Albert Grayson's standing in the dock, a schoolteacher, quiet, respectable, a man whose most grievous offence had once been the misplacement of a library book, now stood accused of brutally murdering Sir Geoffrey Pemberton in cold blood. The case had unfolded swiftly, perhaps too swiftly, Miss Marple thought, as she adjusted her hat with delicate precision from her seat near the back. The judge, a man of impeccable moustache and limited patience, surveyed the court over his gold-rimmed spectacles, his manner suggesting he found most human folly both tedious and predictable. The barristers, on the other hand, relished the occasion, and none more so than Mr. Archibald Lennox, King's Counsel for the Crown. A sharp-eyed, silver-haired gentleman with the manner of a well-fed fox, he rose with practised grace, straightened his cuffs, and turned to the jury with a look of measured solemnity. "Members of the jury, the case before you is, at its heart, a simple one. A wealthy man is dead. A schoolteacher burdened with motive, opportunity, and undeniable evidence stands accused. The law requires proof beyond reasonable doubt. Today you shall find that proof in abundance." His words settled over the room like a net. The first witness called was Emily Carter, the maid at Pemberton Manor. She stepped into the witness box with palpable unease, her hands gripping the railing as if it alone could keep her upright. Her eyes flickered to Albert Grayson, and she quickly looked away. Lennox approached, his voice warm, encouraging, like an uncle coaxing a reluctant child. "Miss Carter, you were present in Pemberton Manor on the night of the murder?" "Yes, sir." "Tell the court in your own words what you saw." Emily swallowed. I was clearing the dining room, sir. I heard the front door open. I looked up and saw Mr. Grayson enter. I remember because I thought it strange. He never called at that hour." Lennox nodded sympathetically. "And what did you do?" "I went back to my work, sir. I didn't think much of it. Then later, when I passed the study, I thought I heard voices raised." "Raised?" Lennox echoed. "You mean to say an argument?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, sir." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Lennox let it settle before continuing. "Did you recognize any of the voices?" I wasn't sure, sir." Lennox smiled, as though he found this quite endearing. "Come now, Miss Carter, surely you would recognize Sir Geoffrey's voice, having worked for him all these years?" Emily's hands twisted in her lap. "Yes, sir. Yes, I did recognize his voice." "And the other voice, was it Mr. Grayson's?" A pause. Then, reluctantly, I think so, sir." This one simply looked resigned. The next witness was Mr. Tobias Pratt, a retired watchmaker and the undisputed expert in St. Mary Mead on other people's affairs. He took the stand with visible relish, puffing out his chest beneath a rather garish checkered waistcoat. Lennox regarded him with a cool smile. "Mr. Pratt, would you please tell the court what you heard on the evening of the murder?" Mr. Pratt cleared his throat importantly. "Well, sir, I was just locking up my shop when I saw Mr. Grayson walking toward Pemberton Manor. Thought it was odd. He's not one for late visits, you see. Then, just a short while later, I heard shouting." "Shouting, Mr. Pratt?" "Yes, sir. Loud voices. Angry voices. I couldn't make out all the words, but I did hear Sir Geoffrey say something about not getting away with it, and 'I'll see you ruined.'" A ripple of excitement ran through the court. Lennox turned slightly to the jury as if to say, "There, you see?" "And did you recognize the other voice?" Mr. Pratt hesitated. "Well, no, sir. Not exactly." Lennox arched a brow. "Not exactly. It was muffled, sir, but it was a man's voice. Sounded agitated, if you understand me." "And you assumed it was Mr. Grayson?" "Well, yes. Who else would it be?" Albert's defence counsel, a well-meaning but hapless man named Mr. Darlington, made half-hearted attempts to cast doubt upon the testimonies, but the damage had been done. Emily Carter had seen Albert enter. Mr. Pratt had heard an argument. The murder weapon bore Albert's fingerprints. It was circumstantial, yes, but damning nonetheless. The jury was gone less than an hour. When they returned, their expressions were grim, and the foreman, a ruddy-faced farmer, stood and cleared his throat. "We find the defendant, Albert Grayson, guilty of murder." A collective intake of breath. Albert, for the first time, visibly sagged. His fingers tightened on the wooden railing before him. The judge adjusted his spectacles. "Albert Grayson, you have been found guilty of the murder of Sir Geoffrey Pemberton. You are hereby sentenced to death by hanging." "May God have mercy on your soul." A cold, terrible silence settled over the court. Miss Marple remained very still. Her knitting lay forgotten on her lap. Later, outside the courthouse, Miss Marple watched the grey sky stretch endlessly over the rooftops of Melford, her sharp blue eyes lost in thought. Beside her, Mrs. Finch was dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Well, it's done. Poor Mr. Grayson. But what can one do?" Miss Marple, hands folded neatly over her handbag, gave a small, thoughtful smile. "Oh," she murmured, "one can always do something." She turned, stepping away from the crowd, moving with deliberate purpose toward the waiting carriage. After all, Albert Grayson was innocent. and Miss Marple intended to prove it. The courtroom air felt heavy, thick with a tension that pressed down upon the assembled villagers like the onset of a summer storm. The oak-panelled walls, the chilled stone floors, and the imperious gaze of the judge only served to heighten the sense of the inevitable. Albert Grayson, a man of quiet habits and no criminal history, stood in the dock, his face drawn but composed. The verdict had been read. The words still seemed to echo in the silence. "We find the defendant, Albert Grayson, guilty of murder." There had been a murmur, a few gasps, a cough that sounded too loud in the hush. Then the judge spoke, deliberate and unwavering. "Albert Grayson, you have been found guilty of the wilful murder of Sir Geoffrey Pemberton. The law permits only one punishment for such a crime. You are sentenced to death by hanging, to be carried out 7 days from today. May God have mercy on your soul." Albert barely moved. A slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, a quiet exhale. The whispers in the gallery rose as the enormity of the sentence settled over the room. Sentence, sentence, unsentence. 7 days, not months or years of appeals. 7 days, and it would all be over. The judge gathered his papers. The guards moved toward the dock. The trial was over. Albert's gaze lifted, steady and strangely calm, searching for someone, amidst the sea of faces. And for the briefest of moments his eyes met those of Miss Agatha Marple sitting quietly in the back. She did not look away. By the time the villagers returned to St. Mary Mead, the verdict had already transformed from fact to legend. The streets, normally tranquil with the occasional rattle of a passing cart, now hummed with eager speculation. At the Fox and Hound, the usual evening discussions of weather and church affairs had been abandoned entirely in favour of the trial's great drama. "I never would have thought it," declared Mrs. Harrison, a stout woman with a fondness for pronouncements. "Albert Grayson, a murderer." "Fingerprints don't lie," Mr. Needham the butcher said, with a knowing nod. "And arguing with a man the very night he turns up dead might as well have signed his own confession." Mrs. Finch, the vicar's wife, sipped her tea with a thoughtful air. "I must say, I always found Mr. Grayson rather distant. Not unkind, but distant, as if he carried some great trouble on his shoulders." "Well," Needham said, "it'll be the noose for him come Friday." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. A few seats away, Miss Marple stirred a single lump of sugar into her tea, her expression mild. "Fingerprints don't lie," she murmured. "But people do," Needham frowned, uncertain whether to take offence. "Now, Miss Marple, you're not saying the jury got it wrong?" "Oh, not at all," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Juries are very good at following the facts they are given. The difficulty, I find, is ensuring they have the right facts in the first place." A curious silence followed, and she let it linger just long enough before taking another sip of tea. By the time Miss Marple returned to her modest but well-ordered cottage, the night had fully settled over St. Mary Mead. The quiet ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway was the only sound as she removed her hat and placed it carefully on the stand. She did not light the lamp immediately. Instead, she stood for a long moment at the window, gazing out over the dimly lit streets. Something was wrong. Not wrong in an obvious way. No missing evidence, no glaring contradiction that would send the case tumbling into chaos. No, it was something subtle, something too neat, too convenient. Albert Grayson had been convicted on 3 crucial points. Motive. He had argued with Sir Geoffrey. Opportunity. He had been seen entering the manor, and no one had seen him leave. Physical evidence. His fingerprints on the murder weapon. All very damning. All perfectly arranged. And that, Miss Marple thought, was precisely the problem. Too tidy. Too conclusive. Miss Marple liked puzzles, particularly the kind that presented themselves in apparent certainty. She sat in her favourite chair, folded her hands in her lap, and let her mind wander back over the trial. Emily Carter's testimony, Mr. Pratt's claims about the argument, the fingerprints on the candlestick. It was all too convenient. A man like Albert Grayson, mild, bookish, meticulous, would have been careful, and yet his fingerprints had been found clear as day on the weapon. A curious thing, she reached for her knitting basket, fingers moving instinctively over the familiar wool. "Now, Agatha," she murmured to herself, "let's see who else might have had a reason to wish Sir Geoffrey dead." She would begin in the morning. 7 days was not a long time, but, she thought, it would be enough. The Melford prison was a grim, unremarkable place, a squat, grey-stoned building with thick, iron-barred windows that let in very little light and even less warmth. The air smelled of damp stone and resignation, the kind of place where time did not pass but merely collected like dust in the corners. Miss Agatha Marple, small and unassuming in her well-pressed tweed coat, stepped into the visitor's chamber with a look of mild interest, as if she had simply arrived early for tea. A guard, a stout man with a perpetual scowl, led her toward the heavy wooden door that separated the convicted from the free. "You've got 15 minutes, he grunted, unlocking the door and stepping aside. Miss Marple nodded politely. "Oh, I shouldn't think I'll need any more than that." Beyond the door, sitting stiffly on a narrow bench, was Albert Grayson, the schoolteacher, the man who had been tried, convicted, and sentenced to death in the space of a few short weeks. He was thinner than she remembered, his spectacles sitting crookedly on his nose. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment relief flickered across his face, only to be replaced by something more guarded. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "This is unexpected." She took the seat opposite him, folding her hands neatly over her handbag. "Yes, well," she said pleasantly, "I thought it was high time I had a proper conversation with you. It seems a great many people have been speaking about you, Mr. Grayson, but very few have taken the trouble to speak to you." Albert gave a small, humourless smile. "I don't imagine there's much point now. The jury's made their decision." "Oh, juries are very efficient creatures," Miss Marple said in her mild way. "But efficiency and correctness are not always the same thing, I find. Wouldn't you agree?" Albert studied her for a moment, then gave a slight nod. "Tell me, Mr. Grayson," she continued, her tone light but her gaze unwavering, "about the night of the murder. I should very much like to hear it from you." Albert exhaled, running a hand over his hollowed-out features. "There isn't much to tell," he said at last. "I left my cottage a little before 8. I had written a letter to Sir Geoffrey. Nothing contentious, just an appeal, I suppose?" Miss Marple prompted gently. He gave a bitter chuckle. "Yes, he was planning to evict me. I thought I might reason with him, put forward my case on paper, since the man didn't care to listen when I spoke. So I walked to the manor, slipped the letter under the door of his study, and left." Miss Marple's fingers twitched slightly over her handbag. "And you did not enter the study?" "I did not." She inclined her head. "And yet the prosecution claims that your fingerprints were on the murder weapon." Albert's hands tightened into fists on the table. "I cannot explain that, Miss Marple. I only know that I never so much as touched it." A small pause, just long enough for a thought to settle. "And this letter of yours, Mr. Grayson," Miss Marple continued, "what became of it?" Albert shook his head, his jaw tight. "It should have been found in the study, but when the police searched the room, it wasn't there." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "How very odd!" Albert let out a slow breath. "Inspector Craddock believes I never wrote it at all, that it's a fabrication, an attempt to explain my presence at the house that night." Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her handbag and withdrew a small, folded square of paper. Albert's brow furrowed. "What's that?" "Ah," Miss Marple said, unfolding it with delicate precision. "Just a little list of my own making. A record, you might say, of things that seem rather unusual." Albert leaned forward, curiosity overtaking his despair. "Firstly," Miss Marple began, If you did indeed leave a letter under the door, then someone must have removed it before the police arrived." Albert's eyes widened slightly. "Secondly," she continued, "your fingerprints on the murder weapon are very tidy." "Tidy?" "Oh, yes," Miss Marple nodded. "Perfectly clear, perfectly damning. But a man like yourself, Mr. Grayson, a careful man, a schoolteacher accustomed to order, doesn't seem the sort to handle a brass candlestick so indiscreetly." Albert's mouth parted slightly, but no words came. Miss Marple smiled sweetly. "Which leads me to my third point. If someone took the trouble to remove your letter, and if the fingerprints were, let's say, too convenient, then I must ask myself, who benefits from your conviction?" Albert sat back, the first flicker of something like hope crossing his face. "You believe me?" he murmured. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Oh, my dear Mr. Grayson, it does not matter what I believe. It matters only what I can prove." She glanced at the clock on the wall and rose to her feet, smoothing her skirt. 7 days, Albert said quietly. Miss Marple adjusted her hat. 7 days is quite a lot of time if one knows how to use it properly. And with that she turned and left, her thoughts already spinning in careful, methodical order. There was much to do. The morning air in St. Mary Mead carried the scent of damp earth and early autumn. A deceptive calm, given the whispers that curled through the village like mist over the fields. At the greengrocer's, at the post office, even in the modest pew-line hush of the parish church, the murder of Sir Geoffrey Pemberton remained the topic of every conversation. It was, after all, not every day that a schoolmaster was sent to the gallows. "I always said he had a queer look about him," declared Mrs. Harrison, arranging a neat row of cabbages outside her husband's shop. "Not in an unkind way, of course, very polite man, but the quiet ones are the ones you must watch." Mr. Needham, the butcher, who considered himself something of an authority on matters of justice, nodded solemnly. "It's the evidence, see. His fingerprints were on the candlestick. That sort of thing speaks for itself." Miss Marple, standing quietly by a display of apples, did not interject. She merely smiled, handed over her coins, and departed. And yet, as she made her way back toward the modest warmth of her cottage, her mind was already occupied with one singular thought. The evidence had spoken. But had it told the truth? Seated comfortably by the crackling hearth in her parlour, Miss Marple reached for her knitting basket, not because she particularly needed to knit at that moment, but because it helped her think. Albert Grayson had sworn without hesitation that he had never touched the murder weapon. And yet the brass candlestick, its heavy base stained with Sir Geoffrey's blood, had borne his fingerprints, clear and incriminating. Too clear, perhaps. Miss Marple's fingers paused over the soft wool. It was a strange thing, was it not, that a man would grip a candlestick so firmly, then leave it behind in such an obvious manner? If Albert had been foolish enough to strike a man down in a moment of rage, surely he would have wiped it clean, or at the very least dropped it in haste, with no time to leave such pristine marks. And yet the fingerprints had been perfect. Too perfect, as if placed there deliberately. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, a small, satisfied gleam in her eye. That was, she thought, something worth exploring. That afternoon, under the polite pretence of a social call, Miss Marple paid a visit to Emily Carter, the maid who had testified against Albert Grayson. Emily lived in a small, neatly kept cottage just beyond the village green, a modest place, but comfortable enough for a woman in service. The door was opened by Emily herself, a young woman with anxious eyes and a pale complexion, who smiled quickly when she saw her visitor. "Oh, Miss Marple, what a surprise!" she said, smoothing her apron with unnecessary care. "Yes, ma'am," Miss Marple replied kindly, stepping inside without invitation. "I thought I should check in on you. Such a dreadful business, isn't it? The trial, all those terrible questions. One can hardly blame you for being quite out of sorts." Emily hesitated, then nodded. "It has been rather awful, yes." Miss Marple settled herself in the small, tidy sitting-room, taking in the modest furnishings, the lace curtains drawn neatly across the windows. "You must be very brave," she remarked, "to have spoken so clearly at the trial. Such a terrible thing to witness, of course. Seeing Mr. Grayson entering the house that night, I mean." Emily swallowed. I only told the truth, Miss Marple." "Oh, naturally, dear," Miss Marple smiled. "Though, if I might ask, you said you saw him through the study window, did you not?" Emily nodded, a little too quickly. "Yes, I was outside, near the garden path." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Ah, yes. Such a difficult angle, isn't it?" Emily's fingers twitched in her lap. I beg your pardon?" Miss Marple folded her hands primly. "The study windows are quite high, dear, and facing the back garden, if I remember correctly. From the side garden path, one wouldn't have a very clear view inside at all. Certainly not clear enough to identify a person so definitively." A long, heavy silence settled over the room. Emily's throat bobbed as she struggled to maintain her composure. "Oh, I suppose I might have been mistaken about where I was standing." Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled ever so slightly. "Oh, of course, dear, quite understandable. Memories are so troublesome, aren't they? One is quite certain of something one day, and the next, well, it's all a bit muddled." Emily forced a smile, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her. Miss Marple rose from her chair, adjusting her gloves. "Well, I shan't trouble you further. Such a pleasure to see you, my dear. And do be careful with what you remember. People are ever so quick to believe what they hear in court, aren't they?" As she stepped out into the cool afternoon air, Miss Marple's smile faded. She had seen it, the slight tremor in Emily's hands, the flicker of panic behind her polite expression. Emily Carter had lied. And that, Miss Marple thought, was very interesting indeed. There is something peculiar about the dead. In life, a man might be disliked, resented, even feared, but the moment he is murdered, he acquires a certain tragic nobility. That was certainly the case with Sir Geoffrey Pemberton, at least among those who had never met him. To those who had, the tenants of Pemberton Manor's lands, the business associates he had deceived, and the relatives he had treated with undisguised contempt, his death was met with a response that ranged from muted surprise to quiet satisfaction. Miss Marple, sitting comfortably in the sunlit corner of the Fox and Hound, listened as Mr. Caleb Norris, the village's solicitor, recounted the intricacies of Sir Geoffrey's financial entanglements. "A complicated estate," Norris muttered, stirring his tea with absent-minded precision. "Not to mention a highly disagreeable one." Miss Marple smiled politely. "He was rather unpopular, wasn't he?" The solicitor gave a short laugh devoid of amusement. "My dear Miss Marple, I've been practising law for 35 years, and I don't believe I've ever known a man with quite so many people actively awaiting his demise." "How interesting," Miss Marple murmured. Norris sighed, running a thin hand over his receding hairline. "Let's begin with Henry Pemberton, shall we? The nephew?" Miss Marple tilted her head, as if mildly interested in a passing bit of gossip. "Oh, yes. The one who was, shall we say, disappointed by the will?" "Disappointed?" Norris let out a dry chuckle. "More like outraged. Henry was meant to inherit the estate, you see. That was always the expectation. He lived as though the money was already his. Extravagant tastes, bad investments, the sort of debts one doesn't pay off." "But then the will changed," Miss Marple prompted. "Yes." Norris leaned forward slightly. "Sir Geoffrey cut him off, disinherited him entirely." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "Dramatic." "Indeed," Norris agreed. "The new will left the bulk of the estate to charity, with the remainder going to—" He paused, lowering his voice slightly. "A rather surprising beneficiary." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, do tell." Norris hesitated, but then sighed. "Emily Carter." Miss Marple did not react outwardly, but inwardly a small piece of the puzzle slid into place. The maid. The same maid whose testimony had helped convict Albert Grayson. "Sir Geoffrey," Norris continued, "had an unusual relationship with his household staff. Emily had been in his service for over a decade. There were rumours, you understand." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And Henry?" "Furious, naturally. He contested the will even before the murder, claimed his uncle had been manipulated. Miss Marple sipped her tea. And the will, was it ever executed? Norris shook his head. It was still in probate, which means in the event of Sir Geoffrey's sudden passing, the previous will, naming Henry as heir, would likely remain valid. Miss Marple's fingers paused over her knitting. That was very interesting indeed. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple called on Mr. Tobias Finch, a retired banker who had once been a business associate of Sir Geoffrey's, though to hear Finch tell it, one might assume he had been a reluctant accomplice in a great many unfortunate dealings. They sat in the modest warmth of Finch's study, surrounded by shelves of leather-bound books and the faint scent of old paper and pipe smoke. "A shrewd man," Finch said, his tone cool and measured. "And a greedy one." Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. "Oh dear, that is rather a dreadful combination, isn't it?" Finch let out a snort of agreement. "He had enemies everywhere," he continued. "Business rivals, former partners, even investors who had been ruined by his dealings. The man was remarkably adept at making money, so long as it was at someone else's expense." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "And had any of these former associates threatened Sir Geoffrey recently?" Finch exhaled slowly. "There was one, Roland Vasseur, a French financier. Sir Geoffrey swindled him out of a rather large sum." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Oh? And what did Mr. Vasseur do?" "Threatened him, naturally," Finch said, with a wave of his hand. "Said he'd ruin him, make him suffer. He was in England at the time of the murder, you know. Some business in London." Miss Marple noted that carefully. "Though I dare say it would be terribly inconvenient for a foreigner to commit such a crime," Finch added, with a faint smirk. Miss Marple did not reply immediately. Instead, she glanced toward the large, walnut writing desk in the corner of the room. "Tell me, Mr. Finch," she said, her tone deceptively light, "you've worked in finance for many years. What would you say is the simplest way to commit fraud?" Finch blinked. "Fraud? Good heavens, Miss Marple, I wouldn't know," she smiled. "Oh, don't be modest, dear. I simply mean what is the most convenient way for a wealthy man to avoid paying a debt." Finch stared at her. Then, slowly a wry smile formed on his lips. "Why, that's easy," he said. "A man can always avoid paying his debts, Miss Marple, if he's dead." Miss Marple nodded knowingly. That, she thought, was precisely what she had expected to hear. By the end of the day, Miss Marple had quite a list of suspects. Henry Pemberton, disinherited nephew who stood to regain his fortune if Sir Geoffrey died before the new will was finalized. Emily Carter, the maid, named as a beneficiary, and a woman who had already proven herself willing to lie. Roland Vasseur, a cheated financier, with both motive and opportunity. And then, of course, there was Albert Grayson, still sitting in his prison cell, awaiting his execution. Miss Marple closed her notebook, her expression mild but determined. Yes. There were many who had reason to want Sir Geoffrey dead, and only one of them had taken it upon themselves to see it done. The question was who? And more importantly, how much time did she have left to find out? The reading of a will, Miss Marple always thought, was one of the most revealing moments in the life, or rather, the afterlife of a wealthy man. It had a way of distilling human nature to its essence, greed, resentment, relief, even delight, though the latter was usually disguised with a thin veil of grief. But what happened when there was no will to be read at all? This question occupied Miss Marple's thoughts as she sat in the dusty office of Caleb Norris, the village solicitor, her knitting needles clicking softly as the man paced behind his desk, muttering to himself. "It was here," he said for the third time, running a hand over his thinning hairline. "It was right here." Miss Marple tilted her head ever so slightly. "The new will? Yes." Norris huffed. "I drafted it myself a mere 3 months ago. Sir Geoffrey had made up his mind. He was adamant that his nephew, Henry, would inherit nothing. Everything, the estate, the accounts, the lands, was to go to charity." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "And to Miss Emily Carter." Norris shot her a sharp look but then sighed. "Yes, a modest sum, comparatively speaking. But now the will is gone, and the only one left in my files is the previous will, the one in which Henry still inherits everything." Miss Marple paused her knitting, her face a picture of polite curiosity. "How very strange," she murmured. "Tell me, Mr. Norris," she continued, watching the solicitor with mild interest. When was the last time you saw the new will? Norris rubbed his chin, thinking. It would have been a week before Sir Geoffrey's death. He had come in to make one final amendment, nothing significant, just some minor language about investments. And after that, it went into my filing cabinet, he said, his frown deepening, where it should still be. Miss Marple leaned forward ever so slightly. Did Sir Geoffrey ever take the will home with him? Norris shook his head firmly. Absolutely not. He was quite particular about legal matters. Miss Marple tapped her knitting needles lightly against one another. Then, if it was not Sir Geoffrey who removed it, that means someone else must have done so, before or after his death. The solicitor blinked at her, as though seeing the problem for the first time. But who would have access? He asked. Miss Marple smiled sweetly. Why, dear Mr. Norris, that is precisely the question, isn't it? Later that afternoon, as she strolled through the village, Miss Marple's mind worked with quiet precision. Sir Geoffrey's death had been remarkably well-timed, at least for one particular person. Albert Grayson, the schoolmaster, had been convicted, but he stood to gain nothing from Sir Geoffrey's demise. No money, no property, only a swift and unjust death. No, the real beneficiary was Henry Pemberton. With the new will missing, the old one, the one that restored Henry as heir, would take precedence. Which, Miss Marple murmured to herself, suggests two possibilities. She counted them off neatly, as if tallying stitches on her needles. 1. The will was stolen before the murder, meaning someone had been planning this for quite some time. 2. The will was stolen after the murder, meaning someone had seized an opportunity once Sir Geoffrey was dead. Either way, it pointed to one key truth. Whoever took the will was also very likely the murderer. That evening, Miss Marple took it upon herself to call upon Henry Pemberton, who was staying rather smugly, she imagined, at Pemberton Manor. He greeted her at the door with perfectly manufactured politeness, dressed impeccably in a tailored waistcoat and silk tie, a glass of brandy in hand. A pleasure as always, Miss Marple, he said, ushering her inside. Miss Marple, in her usual pleasant, grandmotherly manner, took in the room carefully, the heavy oak furniture, the portraits of long-dead Pembertons, and the faint scent of cigar smoke lingering in the air. Such a tragic business, she said as she took a seat. Sir Geoffrey's murder, of course, and now the most dreadful confusion about his will. Henry's expression did not change, but she noticed a slight tightening in his jawline. Ah, yes, that unfortunate business, he said smoothly. A terrible shock. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled knowingly. One imagines it must have been quite the surprise for you, Mr. Pemberton. He laughed lightly, leaning back into his chair. I don't see why. My uncle was an unpredictable man. He changed his mind about things often. Miss Marple nodded, as if entirely convinced. Oh, of course. Though I suppose you were aware that, in his last will, he had chosen to leave you nothing. Henry took a measured sip of his brandy. So I've heard. Miss Marple smiled. How very fortunate, then, that the previous will has surfaced. The one that does leave you everything. This time Henry said nothing. There was a silence not too long, not too short, before he exhaled and set his glass down. Miss Marple, he said smoothly, I do hope you're not suggesting that I would stoop to stealing my uncle's will. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked together once. Oh, no, dear boy, she said, smiling sweetly. I should think that whoever stole the will also killed Sir Geoffrey, and that would be quite a dreadful thing to accuse someone of, wouldn't it? Henry held her gaze for a fraction too long, his lips just barely curving into a smile. Indeed, he said. Quite dreadful. Pemberton Manor loomed in the pale moonlight, its ivy-clad facade and darkened windows lending it an air of eerie solitude. It had been a house of wealth and privilege, but now it seemed merely a house of secrets. Miss Marple, clad in her sensible tweed coat and gloves, walked briskly up the gravel path, her cane tapping lightly against the stones. She had long known that nighttime was an excellent time for quiet discovery, as people spoke more freely when they were tired, when their guard was down. And besides, she had always believed that maids often knew far more than they ever let on. The door was answered by Emily Carter herself, looking flustered, her apron slightly askew. Oh, Miss Marple, she stammered, smoothing down the front of her dress. What are you doing here so late? Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. Oh, my dear, I was simply passing by and thought I should have a word with you. Such a dreadful thing, this business with poor Mr. Grayson, isn't it? And you, having to testify, it must have been so terribly distressing. Emily swallowed, her eyes flickering toward the staircase, where Miss Marple guessed the housekeeper, Mrs. Tremaine, might be lingering just out of sight. "Of course, miss. Come in." Miss Marple stepped inside, taking in the dimly lit hallway, the faint scent of furniture polish, and the distant creak of floorboards overhead. Yes, secrets lived in these walls. Emily led her into the small servants' sitting room, where the embers of a dying fire cast flickering shadows along the walls. The maid perched uneasily on the edge of a chair, her hands twisting in her lap. "You said, in your testimony, that you saw Mr. Grayson entering the house at 8:15. Is that correct?" Miss Marple asked mildly, settling herself into a chair with a comfortable sigh. Emily nodded quickly. "Yes, miss. I saw him clear as day through the study window." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked together lightly. "Mem. Curious," she murmured. Emily blinked. "Miss? Oh, just that I was thinking about the positioning of the study windows," Miss Marple continued, her tone light and thoughtful. "From the garden path you would have had to be standing at just the right angle to see inside properly. And even then, with the curtains partially drawn, how could you have been so sure it was Mr. Grayson?" A hush fell over the room, broken only by the faint ticking of the mantel clock. Emily's hands tightened. I know what I saw," she said, but her voice wavered. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Yes, dear. But the trouble with knowing things is that sometimes one remembers them the way one wishes to, rather than how they truly were." Emily said nothing, her gaze locked on the fireplace, her cheeks burning. Miss Marple leaned forward just slightly. "Tell me, dear, were you covering for someone?" Emily's breath hitched, her fingers clenching in the fabric of her apron. And then her composure broke. I didn't want to lie," she whispered. But I had to." Miss Marple did not press her. Instead, she waited, as still and patient as a cat at the edge of a mouse hole. At last, Emily took a shuddering breath and lifted her head. "I wasn't in the garden at all," she admitted. "I was in," she hesitated, then whispered it, "the library." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted ever so slightly. "Ah," she murmured. Now, that was very interesting indeed. Miss Marple had never been a great believer in coincidences. When people made hasty decisions, when they said things that didn't quite align, there was usually something hidden beneath the surface. And so, when Emily reached for a dustcloth to fidget with, Miss Marple spotted it immediately. The small, folded note, half buried beneath the pile of linens. "Oh dear," she said, reaching for it before Emily could stop her. "What's this now?" Emily gasped, her face draining of color, but Miss Marple had already unfolded the paper. A delicate, slanted script met her eyes, and in an instant the puzzle shifted into place. "My dearest E, meet me in the library at 8 o'clock. We must speak before it's too late." Miss Marple's lips pursed ever so slightly. She looked up at Emily, who was now visibly shaking. "Henry Pemberton," Miss Marple said quietly. "This letter was from him, wasn't it?" Emily pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. As she hesitated, "He told me to say I saw Mr. Grayson. He said it was the only way to keep everything from coming out." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And what, my dear," she asked gently, "did he wish to keep from coming out?" Emily shook her head fiercely, tears brimming in her eyes. I don't know. He only said that if people knew the truth it would be worse." Miss Marple sighed, folding the letter neatly and tucking it into her handbag. "Yes," she said softly. "I imagine it would." As Miss Marple stepped out into the cool night air, her mind whirred with quiet intensity. Emily Carter had not only lied about her whereabouts, she had been with Henry Pemberton at the very moment Albert Grayson was supposedly committing murder, which meant two things. 1. Henry had an alibi. A secret one, yes, but an alibi all the same. And 2, if Henry had an alibi, then whoever had killed Sir Geoffrey had done so without his involvement. And that, Miss Marple thought, changed everything. She glanced back at the manor, the soft glow of the candlelight flickering behind the curtains, and considered what she now knew. Someone had gone to great lengths to frame Albert Grayson. Someone had ensured that the real culprit remained in the shadows. And someone had wanted Henry Pemberton out of the picture entirely. The case was unraveling, and whoever was behind it had just made a mistake. Miss Marple, adjusting her hat, set off briskly toward the village. There was work to be done. The night in St. Mary Mead had the same quiet rhythm it always did. The twilight dimmed slowly, the air turning crisp and cool as street lamps flickered on, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets. Miss Marple, having finished her carefully thought-out observations for the day, took it upon herself to take a brisk walk home to her cottage. The journey was short and uneventful, perfect for mulling over the intricacies of the case. She had just crossed the small bridge over the stream, the scent of damp earth hanging in the air, when she decided that a stroll would do her good before she retired for the night. She had not yet had time to unravel all the shifting threads of Sir Geoffrey's murder. But something gagged at her, and there was no harm in a bit of exercise. Her trusty bicycle waited by the nearby gate, as it always did. Its frame was solid, its wheels dependable. Miss Marple had long believed that there was nothing like a ride in the evening to clear the mind. What she did not know, of course, was that someone had no intention of letting her get very far. Miss Marple placed her hand on the cold metal handlebars, settled herself onto the saddle, and began pedaling. The faint squeak of the tires was the only sound besides the rhythm of her breathing as she glided down the quiet road. The moon cast a faint, silvery glow over the path ahead, illuminating her way as she moved through the peaceful village. A few minutes in, Miss Marple noticed a subtle shift in the motion of the bicycle, as though something was wrong with the wheel. The next instant there was a sickening jolt. Before she could react, the bicycle lurched violently to one side, the front wheel jerking sharply, throwing her off balance. The world seemed to tilt as Miss Marple struggled to regain control. Her hands gripped the handlebars with a sudden desperation. She pulled to the side, her heart racing, the world spinning. The front tire had buckled, the spoke somehow twisted out of place, the rim wedged in a way that rendered the wheel useless. In a last-ditch effort, she swung her legs off and leapt onto the grass verge, barely managing to keep her balance as she stumbled away from the wrecked bicycle. A pulse was pounding in her ears as she looked at the damaged wheel. It was clear someone had tampered with it. The rubber had been slashed, the spokes had been bent, and the tire deflated in such a way that it would have been impossible to ride any further. Miss Marple stood there, catching her breath, for a moment longer than was necessary, her sharp mind already ticking over the details. "Well now," she murmured aloud, "it seems someone doesn't want me asking questions." It took Miss Marple only a moment to gather her thoughts, and then, with a sigh, she began walking back toward the village. The ride would be abandoned for now, but the incident had only confirmed her suspicions. There were forces at work here, forces that did not want her uncovering the truth about Sir Geoffrey's death. By the time she reached her cottage, she was no longer flustered. Nothing had changed after all. The same people were still at play, and the same motives were still at work. The bicycle would be a minor inconvenience, but nothing more. The real question was who had gone to such lengths to stop her. As Miss Marple entered her cozy, well-kept home, she didn't even bother to light the lamp immediately. Instead, she went straight for the drawing room, where her writing desk sat in the far corner. Papers, pens, and books were spread out on the desk, the bits and pieces of the investigation she had been carefully considering. The sabotage of a bicycle was not an accident. It had been deliberate. Whoever had done it had wanted her to stumble, to fall, or at the very least to be delayed. Why? Miss Marple reached for the stack of notes she had gathered from the previous day's visit to Pemberton Manor. Albert Grayson's trial had been a puzzle, no doubt, but the missing will and the complex relationships between Sir Geoffrey's family and his business dealings were only beginning to reveal their true nature. Her mind worked quickly as she rearranged the facts in her head. It was clear that someone wanted Albert Grayson out of the picture, and that someone might have gone to even greater lengths to silence anyone who might challenge their position. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knocking at the door. Her brow furrowed as she glanced at the clock. Who could be calling at this hour? With a quiet sigh, she rose from her chair and made her way to the door. Upon opening it, she was greeted by the last person she had expected to see, Inspector Craddock. The man, tall and somewhat gaunt, stood in the doorway, his expression hard, but there was something in his eyes, something that suggested he was not simply here for social pleasantries. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, "I trust I'm not disturbing you." Miss Marple smiled politely, though her mind was still racing with the events of the night. "Not at all, Inspector. How may I help you?" Craddock glanced over his shoulder, as though he were checking for eavesdroppers, before stepping inside. "I have something I need to ask you," he said quietly, shutting the door behind him. "It concerns Albert Grayson, and the evidence you've been gathering. The vicarage at St. Mary Mead was a place of quiet order and simplicity, its walls lined with dusty theological books, its furniture polished to an understated gleam. The vicar, Reverend Arthur Clement, was a kindly man in his 60s, with spectacles that forever seemed on the verge of sliding off his nose and a manner that suggested he had long ago made peace with the eccentricities of his parishioners. Miss Marple had always found him to be a man of quiet intelligence, often overlooked by those who mistook gentleness for foolishness. She sat across from him in the cosy sitting room, sipping tea from delicate china as the autumn wind rattled the window-panes. "It's a terrible business, Miss Marple," the vicar was saying, shaking his head. "Sir Geoffrey may not have been universally beloved, but murder, well, it's not the sort of thing one expects in a place like St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple gave a sympathetic nod, her fingers lightly wrapped around the teacup. "Yes, indeed. And yet, the unexpected does happen rather more often than people think, doesn't it?" The vicar sighed. "It does seem so. And now, poor Mr. Grayson." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Yes, Mr. Grayson. But you see, Reverend, I do wonder if we've all been looking at this entirely the wrong way." The vicar blinked. "How do you mean?" Miss Marple took a measured sip of tea. "Sir Geoffrey was a man with many enemies, that much is clear. But I've begun to wonder if his murder was not so much a crime of passion as it was a matter of business." At this, the vicar's expression changed. It was subtle, a flicker of recollection, a slight furrowing of the brow. "A matter of business," he repeated slowly. Miss Marple watched him keenly, though her expression remained mild. "Yes, you wouldn't happen to know if Sir Geoffrey had any, shall we say, pressing financial dealings in his final days, would you?" Reverend Clement hesitated. Then, as if deciding there was no harm in sharing, he nodded. "Now that you mention it," he said, setting down his teacup, "there was something rather odd." Miss Marple waited patiently. The vicar laced his fingers together. It was the day before he died. Sir Geoffrey came by the vicarage completely unexpected. He was in a peculiar state, muttering about a business meeting he'd had that afternoon. Said he'd been dealing with a man who was not to be trusted. I remember it distinctly because he was more agitated than I'd ever seen him. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-stitch. "How very interesting," she murmured. The vicar continued. "He mentioned a name, Mr. Dunwoody." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Mr. Dunwoody?" she repeated, with a slight lilt of curiosity. "Yes, I'd never heard of him before." And to be quite frank, Miss Marple, the whole conversation was unsettling. Sir Geoffrey wasn't the type to doubt himself, but he seemed genuinely concerned. He said something about a document he needed to secure, and that he'd better take precautions. But before I could ask him what he meant, he changed the subject. Miss Marple tapped her knitting needles together thoughtfully. "A document, you say," she mused. "Wouldn't that be something now?" The vicar sighed. "I thought nothing of it at the time. But when I heard he had been murdered the very next day," Miss Marple gave him a reassuring pat on the hand. "You were quite right not to dwell on suspicions without proof, Reverend," she said kindly. "But now that we know, I believe it is time to find this Mr. Dunwoody." The next morning Miss Marple made her way to the village post office, where Mrs. Hayward, the ever-efficient postmistress, sat perched behind the counter, sorting letters with an air of great importance. "Ah, good morning, Miss Marple," she greeted, pushing her spectacles up her nose. "What can I do for you?" Miss Marple smiled sweetly. "Oh, just a small inquiry, dear. I was wondering if you had any records of a Mr. Dunwoody, who may have passed through St. Mary Mead in the last week or so." Mrs. Hayward frowned. "Dunwoody, you say?" She paused, tapping a finger against her chin. "Why, yes, there was a gentleman by that name. Arrived on Tuesday morning by train. He sent a telegram from here, if I remember rightly." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "How very interesting. And do you recall where he was staying?" Mrs. Hayward nodded. "At the King's Arms in Melford, just up the road." Miss Marple beamed. "How very helpful, my dear. You truly are the heart of this village." Mrs. Hayward flushed with pleasure. "Oh, it's nothing, Miss Marple. Just keeping things in order." Miss Marple left the post office with a distinct sense of satisfaction. Mr. Dunwoody was not a figment of Sir Geoffrey's anxieties. He was real. And he had been here the day before the murder. But now he was missing. By midday, Miss Marple had made the journey to the King's Arms, where a brief conversation with the innkeeper confirmed what she already suspected. "Mr. Dunwoody?" The innkeeper, a stout woman with an apron dusted in flour, frowned. Odd sort of fellow. Kept to himself. Left in a hurry, though. Packed up and vanished the morning after the murder before breakfast, even. Miss Marple's mind clicked into place. So, Mr. Dunwoody had met with Sir Geoffrey the day before the murder. The next morning he had disappeared without a trace. This was no ordinary business meeting. Something had gone very, very wrong. Miss Marple turned, her sharp blue eyes glinting. There was only one thing left to do. She had to find Mr. Dunwoody before the murderer did. The grand drawing-room of Pemberton Manor was austere and silent, the heavy drapes drawn back just enough to let in the weak afternoon light. The great mahogany fireplace stood unlit, its cavernous mouth yawning like a beast waiting to consume the truth. Miss Marple sat comfortably in a high-backed chair, her hands neatly folded in her lap. To an unknowing observer, she might have seemed entirely at ease, a mere elderly lady enjoying an afternoon of idle conversation. But her sharp blue eyes held the gleam of quiet triumph. The assembled guests, if one could call them, that were far from at ease. At one end of the room, Henry Pemberton lounged against the fireplace, his usual insouciant charm slightly frayed around the edges. He had dressed carefully, of course, his tailored suit impeccable, his silver cufflinks gleaming, but there was an air of unease about him now. Beside him, Emily Carter, the maid, sat with her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles were white. She was pale, her normally composed demeanor slipping, her eyes darting toward Henry every few moments. Inspector Craddock stood near the doorway, his broad shoulders stiff, arms crossed, as he surveyed the room with a look of practiced disinterest. The others were mere spectators, Mr. Norris. The solicitor, Miss Tremaine, the housekeeper, and Tobias Finch, a business associate of Sir Geoffrey's who had insisted on attending, though his interest seemed largely academic. Miss Marple took a delicate sip of tea, then set her cup down with a decisive clink. "Now," she said mildly, "I do believe it is time we settled this once and for all." A silence stretched, taut as a wire. Henry exhaled, offering his usual lazy smile, though it did not quite reach his eyes. "Really, Miss Marple," he drawled. "All this drama. Are we to expect a confession, or is this merely a social experiment in tension-building?" Miss Marple smiled sweetly. "Oh, I wouldn't dream of asking for a confession, Mr. Pemberton. That would be terribly inconvenient for you, wouldn't it?" His brows lifted just slightly, but Miss Marple had already turned her attention elsewhere. "You see, I have been considering a great many things. There was, of course, the matter of Mr. Albert Grayson, and the great tragedy of his conviction." Emily flinched at the mention of Grayson, her fingers twisting in her lap. And then there was the problem of the missing will, which conveniently disappeared before Sir Geoffrey's death and allowed an earlier version, one that left everything to Mr. Henry Pemberton to remain legally valid. Henry's expression remained carefully neutral, but there was a tightness in his jaw now. Miss Marple continued, her voice light but unrelenting. "Then, of course, there was the matter of Albert's letter, the one he claimed to have slipped beneath Sir Geoffrey's study door on the night of the murder." Norris, the solicitor, frowned deeply. "I thought that letter never existed." "Oh, it did," Miss Marple assured him. "Only it never reached Sir Geoffrey at all. The room seemed to shrink around them. Someone intercepted it before Sir Geoffrey could read it," she went on. "And it was Emily Carter who ensured that letter never saw the light of day." Emily gasped audibly, her hands clenching into fists. That's not true." But Henry stiffened beside her, his gaze darkening. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Oh, but it is, my dear. Because you weren't in the garden path when you claimed to have seen Mr. Grayson entering the manor, were you? You were inside in the library, with Mr. Henry Pemberton." Emily looked as if she might faint. Henry let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. Well, quite a performance." Miss Marple ignored him entirely, her eyes fixing on Emily with gentle insistence. "You weren't just lying to protect him, were you, my dear? You were doing as you were told, because Mr. Pemberton needed you to provide a false alibi, and in return you were meant to inherit a small but generous sum in Sir Geoffrey's new will." A horrified silence followed. Henry exhaled, amused. "You do have a talent for storytelling, Miss Marple. I imagine it's what keeps you entertained in a village like this." Miss Marple turned her bright blue gaze on him, serene and utterly unshaken. "It was all rather neatly done, Mr. Pemberton," she said. "You knew Sir Geoffrey intended to cut you off entirely. You knew that the moment the new will was finalized, you would be ruined. And so you did what any clever man with a great deal to lose might do. You decided to act before it was too late." She set her knitting needles down deliberately. "You stole the will," she continued, "so that it would never be executed. And then you had to ensure your uncle never lived long enough to reinstate it." Henry's smile had vanished entirely now. Emily, meanwhile, was shaking her head in silent horror. I never meant," she stammered. Miss Marple's voice softened. "I believe that, dear. But you were an accomplice nonetheless. You took that letter and made sure Sir Geoffrey never read it. You helped Mr. Pemberton construct his false alibi. You even lied in court, didn't you?" Emily's face crumpled. Her voice cracked. "I didn't know he was going to." Henry's hand shot out, grabbing Emily's wrist. "That's quite enough." Emily flinched, her eyes wide with growing terror. Miss Marple watched them calmly, then turned to Inspector Craddock, who had remained silent but watchful throughout. "Well, Inspector," she asked, as though inquiring about the weather. "I believe you have enough now, don't you?" Craddock let out a slow, measured breath, then stepped forward, reaching into his coat pocket. "Henry Pemberton," he said, his voice cool and authoritative, "I'm arresting you for the murder of Sir Geoffrey Pemberton. And Emily Carter, you will be charged as an accessory to the crime." Emily let out a sob, but Henry only laughed. "Very clever," he murmured, casting Miss Marple an unreadable look. "I should have known better than to underestimate a spinster with knitting needles." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Oh, my dear boy," she said, eyes twinkling, "you really should have." The sky over St. Mary Mead was a dull, steely grey, the morning chill creeping over the cobbled streets as Miss Marple hurried through the village with an urgency most uncharacteristic of her usual measured pace. The small handbag at her side bounced with every step, containing inside it the final piece of evidence, a crumpled love letter, ink still clear, the damning proof that Albert Grayson was innocent and that Henry Pemberton and Emily Carter were guilty. And yet, innocence meant nothing unless it was proved in time. Albert Grayson had been sentenced to die at noon, and it was already 9:30. Miss Marple did not run, but her steps were unquestionably brisk. She had long believed that haste often led to errors, but there were times, critical moments, when one must act swiftly and without hesitation. And this was one of them. As she rounded the bend toward the police station, her mind was already anticipating the resistance she would face. Inspector Craddock was a sensible man, yes, but he had a deep-rooted suspicion of amateur detectives, particularly those who knitted while solving crimes. Still, facts were facts, and Miss Marple was not a woman easily dismissed. The Melford police station was a squat, brick building with a cold, institutional air, made all the more unwelcoming by the presence of Inspector Craddock, standing with arms folded across his chest, a cigarette dangling from his lips, as he surveyed a pile of paperwork. He looked up as Miss Marple entered, his brows lifting in mild surprise. "Miss Marple," he greeted, his voice laced with his usual gruff courtesy. "I wasn't expecting you quite so early." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly, though she did not waste a moment on pleasantries. "Inspector, I must speak with you at once. It is a matter of utmost urgency." Craddock sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. "Miss Marple, if this is about a man's life, Inspector," Miss Marple interrupted, her voice sharp. "A man who, unless we act immediately, will be executed for a crime he did not commit." That caught his attention. Craddock straightened. "Go on," he said, his tone shifting slightly. Miss Marple opened her handbag with precise efficiency, withdrawing the letter, the very one she had found hidden beneath Emily Carter's linens. "This," she said, placing it on his desk, "proves beyond a doubt that Albert Grayson could not have killed Sir Geoffrey Pemberton." Craddock picked it up, his frown deepening as he read. The letter, written in Henry Pemberton's neat, slanted handwriting, was short but devastating. "My dearest E, meet me in the library at 8 o'clock. We must speak before it's too late." H. Craddock's brow furrowed further. "You see," Miss Marple said calmly, "Emily Carter claimed in her testimony that she saw Albert Grayson entering the manor at 8:15 p.m. But she could not have seen him because she was in the library with Henry Pemberton at the time." Craddock sat back in his chair, turning the letter over in his hands. "And this proves she lied," he muttered. "Indeed," Miss Marple said, "and if she lied about that, then she may very well have lied about everything else." Craddock exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "Damn it all, Miss Marple." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "Indeed." Craddock stood abruptly, grabbing his coat and hat. "Get the car," he barked at the constable on duty. "We're going to Melford Prison now." The police motor car roared down the road, its tires kicking up a fine spray of mud and gravel as it hurtled toward Melford Prison. Miss Marple sat serenely beside Inspector Craddock, hands folded in her lap, as the inspector gritted his teeth and checked his watch every few minutes. "We're cutting it close," he muttered. Miss Marple, who had already calculated the time precisely, merely nodded. I should imagine we have exactly 13 minutes upon arrival before the execution is carried out. Craddock shot her a sharp look. And if we're too late? Miss Marple did not blink. We shan't be. Craddock muttered something under his breath, but pressed harder on the accelerator. They arrived at Melford Prison with exactly 9 minutes to spare. The prison gates loomed, dark and foreboding, as the motor car skidded to a halt. Craddock leapt out first, flashing his badge at the stunned guards. "Stop the execution," he bellowed. "New evidence has come to light." The guards exchanged uncertain glances. Miss Marple, stepping gracefully from the car, adjusted her hat with meticulous care and added, with far more authority than her small frame should have allowed, "If you do not stop the execution this very moment, gentlemen, I shall personally ensure that your names are remembered in the worst possible way." That, at least, seemed to get things moving. Albert Grayson had already been led to the gallows, his face pale but composed, his spectacles slightly askew. Miss Marple was not a sentimental woman by nature, but even she felt a quiet relief as Craddock stormed into the courtyard, waving the letter like a battle flag. "Call it off," he commanded. "Grayson is innocent." A moment of startled silence. Then a flurry of activity, guards rushing forward, orders being shouted. Albert Grayson, who had already made peace with his fate, simply stared. I don't understand," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Miss Marple, stepping forward, offered him a gentle smile. "You're going home, Mr. Grayson," she said, "and I do believe it is well past time for tea." Albert Grayson stood motionless upon the wooden platform, his hands bound before him, the scratchy rope noose looming above his head like an executioner's final promise. The world felt distant, as if he had already stepped beyond it, his mind quiet, his body resigned. The air in the prison courtyard was heavy, thick with an unspoken tension. The chaplain muttered soft words of comfort that barely reached Albert's ears. He had long since stopped fighting the inevitable. It was absurd, really, he thought. He, a schoolteacher, about to meet his end in the manner of a common murderer. Somewhere in the far recesses of his mind, a thought lingered. If only Miss Marple had been right. If only then, like the crack of a gunshot, a voice shattered the silence. "Stop the execution." The words rang out, cutting through the stillness like a blade through taut string. Albert's eyes snapped open. Inspector Craddock burst into the courtyard, his overcoat flying behind him, his voice carrying with the full force of the law. "Stop this at once," he bellowed. "Albert Grayson is innocent." The executioner froze mid-motion, his gloved hands still adjusting the noose. The warden, a severe-looking man with iron-grey hair, turned, his face a mask of irritation and relief combined. "On whose authority?" he demanded. Craddock strode forward, brandishing a sealed order from the Home Office, its wax seal barely dry. "On the authority of the King's Court," he snapped. "New evidence has come to light. The real killer has been found." A beat of silence. Then the tension snapped. The guards moved at once, untying Albert's hands, removing the noose from his neck. The chaplain stepped back, visibly shaken. Albert stared at the scene unfolding before him, his brain struggling to catch up. "What?" His voice cracked from disuse. "What's happening?" Miss Marple's familiar, calm voice reached him before he saw her. "You are going home, Mr. Grayson." Albert turned, and there she was, Miss Agatha Marple, her hat pinned neatly in place, her hands folded over her handbag, as if she were simply visiting a friend for afternoon tea. She smiled at him, though there was something gentler in her expression than usual. "I do hope you haven't suffered too terribly, dear," she said mildly. "It was all a rather unnecessary ordeal." Albert let out a shaky breath, his legs weak beneath him. You saved me," he whispered. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Well," she said modestly, "I merely saw what others did not wish to see. But let us not dwell on unpleasant things." She smiled again, her sharp blue eyes twinkling. "I believe a cup of tea is very much in order." By the time Miss Marple and Albert Grayson returned to the village, word had already spread. Henry Pemberton and Emily Carter had been arrested at Pemberton Manor, their protests and shocked indignation swiftly drowned by the weight of incontrovertible evidence. Mrs. Hayward, the postmistress, was beside herself with excitement. "Imagine," she exclaimed to anyone who would listen. "A murderer and a perjurer, right under our very noses." At the Foxhound, the regulars spoke in hushed but eager voices. "Always thought there was something slippery about Henry," muttered Mr. Needham, the butcher. And that Emily, added Mrs. Finch, the vicar's wife, so mild-mannered, and yet all the while an accomplice. In the grand sitting-room of Pemberton Manor, Henry Pemberton sat stiffly, his hands cuffed before him, as Inspector Craddock read him his rights. "You had everything to lose, Pemberton," Craddock said coldly, "and you were too clever by half." Henry smirked, but the nervous flicker in his eyes betrayed him. "Perhaps," he admitted, "but one does try to be ambitious, Inspector." Emily Carter, sitting in a trembling heap beside him, was far less composed. I didn't know," she whimpered. "I never meant," Miss Marple tutted softly. "Oh, my dear," she said gently, "but you did know. And that is rather the whole point, isn't it?" Craddock nodded to his men. "Take them away." As Henry was led out, he cast one final look at Miss Marple. "You truly are remarkable, Miss Marple," he murmured. "I underestimated you." Miss Marple gave him a pleasant smile. "A rather common mistake, I find," she said. And with that, Henry Pemberton was taken away, leaving only the ghosts of his ambition behind. Later that evening, Miss Marple and Albert Grayson sat in her cosy cottage, the fire crackling softly, the air scented with freshly brewed tea. Albert, still slightly dazed, turned his cup in his hands, his voice quiet. "If you hadn't intervened," he murmured, "I would have died today." Miss Marple gave a small nod, stirring her tea with measured precision. "Yes," she said simply, "you would have." Albert looked at her, something unreadable in his expression. "How did you know?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear Mr. Grayson," she said, "the truth is always there, if one knows where to look. People do give themselves away, you know." Albert let out a soft, disbelieving chuckle. "It all seems so obvious now. The stolen will, the false alibi, the letter." Miss Marple took a delicate sip of her tea. "Yes," she agreed. "Hindsight does tend to be remarkably insightful. But the trick, you see, is to recognize the truth before it is too late." Albert set down his cup, exhaling slowly. "And now?" he asked. "What happens now?" Miss Marple patted his hand reassuringly. "Now," she said, "you go back to your quiet life. You continue your work, and you let the village tell your story in whispers over tea." Albert chuckled softly. "And what about you, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, I shall remain exactly as I am," she said cheerfully, picking up her knitting. A dear old lady with a rather overactive imagination, and as the fire crackled and the village settled into a new, peaceful normal, Miss Marple merely smiled to herself. Because after all, it was quite extraordinary what people were willing to believe. The quiet of St. Mary Mead had returned. The scandal of Sir Geoffrey Pemberton's murder had settled into the natural rhythm of village life, whispered over morning deliveries, dissected at afternoon tea, and embellished ever so slightly in the retelling. Miss Marple, however, had no need for embellishment. She knew exactly how things had happened. And so, with a deep sense of satisfaction, she sat in her cozy sitting room, sipping tea from her favorite delicate china cup, the fire in the hearth crackling pleasantly. Her hands rested lightly on the soft wool of her knitting, though she had not yet picked it up. A rare moment of stillness. The case was closed. Albert Grayson was free. His life returned to him. Henry Pemberton and Emily Carter were in prison, awaiting the inevitable consequences of their actions. And yet Miss Marple's brow furrowed slightly. Was there truly ever a victory in these matters? A wrong had been righted, yes, but the world remained as it ever was, full of deception, selfishness, and greed. How many others, less fortunate than Mr. Grayson, had not been saved in time? She exhaled softly, taking another sip of tea. "People can be quite wicked, you know," she murmured to herself. "But they always leave a thread to follow." That, at least, was a small comfort. She glanced out of the window, where the last golden rays of the afternoon sun stretched over the rooftops of the village. Life would go on. There would be garden parties and church fetes, scandalous letters delivered with the Morning Post, and more than a few cases of petty gossip masquerading as concern. And somewhere, in some quiet corner of England, another mystery would begin to unfold. Miss Marple smiled faintly. For now, though there was tea to drink, and knitting to finish.